I work at a secret Arctic base. The rules are terrifying. The arrival. The cold bit into my skin the moment I stepped off the transport plane. Even through layers of military-grade winter gear, the chill seeped into my bones like an invasive sickness. The base loomed ahead, a cluster of reinforced steel buildings half buried in snowdrifts, their floodlights struggling against the swirling whiteout. I hadn't asked many questions when I signed the contract. The money was obscene, enough to clear my debts twice over. A 6-month stint as a maintenance worker at an undisclosed Arctic research facility. Easy. They assured me it was all routine. Fix broken pipes, keep the generators running, stay indoors. Simple. But there was one thing they emphasized above all else. The rules. The moment I stepped inside, a tall man in a black parka and mirrored sunglasses was waiting for me. He looked out of place, almost too clean, too well-kept for a place so remote. He introduced himself as Director Harlow. "You're late," he said flatly, though I'd arrived precisely on schedule. "Follow me." No small talk, no welcome speech, just business. The interior of the base was sterile and metallic, corridors stretching in every direction like a maze. The overhead lights hummed, flickering in places. As we walked, I noticed something strange. The deeper we went, the colder it got. Harlow led me to a dimly lit briefing room, where a single document sat on the table. "My contract. Read the rules," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "They are not suggestions." I picked up the paper. The rules were printed in bold, clinical text. But as I read them, a knot of unease formed in my stomach. The rules. Number 1. Do not ask about previous staff members. Number 2. The base is 7 sectors. You are only permitted in designated areas. Do not enter Sector 6 under any circumstances. Number 3. The base follows a strict schedule. Be in your quarters by 10 p.m. sharp. Do not leave your room between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Number 4. If you hear knocking at your door after curfew, do not open it. No one will be there. Number 5. You may see things that do not make sense. Ignore them. Number 6. Do not, under any circumstances, acknowledge the other shift. Number 7. If you hear someone whisper your name from the vents, report to the main office immediately. I looked up at Harlow, expecting some kind of explanation. He only stared back at me, expression unreadable. "This is a joke, right?" I asked, forcing chuckle. "No." A pause. "You'll find that this base operates differently from what you're used to." I didn't know what that meant, but I had already signed the contract. There was no turning back. The first night, by the time I settled into my assigned room, exhaustion was gnawing at me. The quarters were small, nothing more than a cot, a metal desk, and a single overhead light. A vent rattled softly in the corner. 10 p.m. was approaching fast. I wasn't one to buy into superstitions, but something about the rules clung to me. The air felt heavier as I checked the time. 9:58 p.m. 2 more minutes. I decided to test my luck. I cracked the door open and peeked down the hall. Empty. And then, knock, knock, knock. It came from further down, near the storage rooms. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I shut my door instantly, my breath caught in my throat. The rule came flooding back. If you hear knocking after curfew, do not open the door. No one will be there. I locked my door and pressed my back against it, waiting. For a while, silence. And then, a whisper, not from the door, from the vent. I barely heard it at first, a faint murmur carried by the air. But as I strained my ears, I realized it was my name. James. Every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, silence. I barely slept that night. And that was only the first day. The other shift. I woke up to the sound of my alarm blaring at 6 a.m. sharp. My body felt stiff, my muscles tense from a night of barely any sleep. The events of last night played over in my mind. The knocking, the whisper from the vent. I had convinced myself it was just paranoia. Maybe the ventilation system carried sounds from other parts of the base. Maybe someone was pulling some kind of initiation prank on the new guy. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations felt right. I dragged myself out of bed, dressed in my issued uniform, a thick gray jumpsuit with a Borealis Research Division insignia on the shoulder, and headed for the mess hall. The place was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. A few other workers sat scattered at the tables, hunched over their breakfast trays. No one talked. No one even made eye contact. I grabbed some coffee and sat down near a guy who looked only slightly less miserable than the rest. He had dark circles under his eyes, his fingers drumming absently against the table. "You knew," he muttered without looking up. "Yeah," I said. "James." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Should have stayed home, James." I forced a chuckle, but he wasn't joking. Before I could ask him anything, a loudspeaker crackled overhead. "Morning shift, report to your stations. Night shift, return to your quarters." At that, a small group of workers got up and left through the far door. I watched as they shuffled away, heads down, movements slow, their uniforms slightly different from ours. They looked wrong. Their skin seemed almost gray under the harsh lights, their eyes unfocused. No one acknowledged them. No handshakes. No nods. Nothing. And as the last one disappeared down the corridor, I realized something. None of them had spoken a word. The first task, I spent the morning shadowing a senior maintenance worker named Mason. He was a wiry man in his 40s, with an unshaven face and a cigarette constantly hanging from his lips. "This place is falling apart," he grumbled as we walked through the facility's endless corridors. "Pipes freezing, electrical shorting out. We keep patching it up, but it never lasts." I followed him into Sector 3, where we were assigned to fix a heating unit that had stopped working. The room was unbearably cold, frost creeping up the metal walls. As I worked, I tried to steer the conversation toward what had been bothering me. "The night shift," I started, tightening a bolt. "They don't really talk much, huh?" Mason stiffened slightly, but didn't look up. "They do their job," he said flatly. "Yeah, but they look sick. Like really sick." Mason finally met my eyes. There was something unsettling in his expression, like he wanted to warn me, but couldn't. "Let me give you some advice, kid." He lowered his voice. "Don't ask about them. Don't look at them too long. And whatever you do, never, ever try to talk to them." I swallowed hard. "What?" He exhaled a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "Because sometimes they answer." Sector 6. Around noon, I was sent to deliver a report to Director Harlow in the main office. I followed the route Mason had scribbled down for me, passing through various sectors until I reached a long, dimly lit corridor. Something felt off. The air was colder here. Stale. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway was a door marked Sector 6. Unlike the rest of the facility, this door wasn't steel. It was reinforced, thick and heavy, with multiple locks and warning labels plastered across it. I took a step closer, my curiosity getting the best of me. That's when I noticed the scratches. Long, jagged claw marks ran down the metal paneling around the doorframe, as if something had tried to force its way out. I felt my pulse quicken. What the hell was in there? Before I could think too much about it, footsteps echoed behind me. "You're not supposed to be here." I turned sharply to see Harlow standing a few feet away, arms crossed. I got lost," I stammered. His expression didn't change. "You have 3 warnings, James," he said coldly. "This is your first." He grabbed the report from my hands and turned on his heel. Go back to work. I didn't need to be told twice. The rule I broke. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The knocks, the whispers, the other shift, the scratches on the Sector 6 door. Something was seriously wrong with this place. Then a noise. Not knocking, not whispering, shuffling. From the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my head slightly, just enough to peek toward the door. The base was on lockdown after 10 p.m. No one was supposed to be out, but someone was. The shuffling grew louder. Slow, uneven footsteps. They stopped right outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest. Then, knock, knock, knock. The same slow, deliberate rhythm as last night. I clenched my jaw, trying to steady my breathing. Then came something worse. A voice. Low, hollow, not human. James. It dragged my name out in a rasping whisper, like it was trying to taste the sound of it. I squeezed my eyes shut. Do not open the door. No one will be there. The rule repeated in my mind like a mantra. Do not open the door. Do not open the door. But then, something new. A scratching noise, faint but deliberate. Not at the door. At the vent. My stomach twisted as I turned my head. The vent cover was loose. A hand, thin, elongated, pale as frost, was slipping through the gap, reaching toward me. I bolted upright, scrambling back against the wall. The fingers twitched, curling like a spider's legs. And then, it pulled back. The vent snapped shut, and just like that, it was gone. I sat there, heart hammering, sweat beating down my forehead. I had followed the rule. I hadn't opened the door. But the thing in the vents, it didn't need an invitation. The frozen ones. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The hand creeping from the vent, the way its fingers twitched, searching. By the time morning arrived, my body was running on fumes, but I couldn't say a word to anyone. What would I even tell them? That something tried to crawl into my room? That it knew my name? And what disturbed me most wasn't what I saw. It was the fact that it left. It could have come inside, could have taken me, but it didn't. Why? The warning. The mess hall was quieter than usual that morning. A few workers sat hunched over their trays, dark bags under their eyes, eating mechanically, their gazes fixed on their food like prisoners in a silent cafeteria. Mason was already there, sipping coffee, eyes hollow. I dropped into the seat across from him, my voice low. Something came to my room last night. He didn't flinch. He just exhaled. Did you open the door? No. He gave a slow nod. Good. I hesitated, but it didn't knock at first. It was in the vent. That got his attention. His fingers clenched slightly around his cup. That's not normal, he muttered. They knock. That's all they do. They're not supposed to. He stopped himself. I leaned forward. Mason, what are they? His eyes darted toward the security cameras, then back to me. He leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I don't want to know. But listen to me, kid. Something is wrong with this place. I swallowed. Sector 6. Mason paled slightly, shaking his head. I told you not to ask questions. I opened my mouth to push further, but then the intercom crackled to life. Morning shift, report to your stations. Night shift, return to your quarters. And just like yesterday, the other shift rose from their seats. I watched them more closely this time. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like puppets on invisible strings. Their faces were void of expression, lips slightly parted as they shuffled toward the exit. And then one of them stopped, right at the door. A woman, her head tilted slightly, unnaturally far, like something inside her neck had broken. And she was looking right at me. My blood turned to ice. Her lips moved, forming silent words. But I couldn't hear them. I didn't want to hear them. Then, Harlow stepped forward, blocking my view. You have work to do, James. I blinked. The woman was gone. The frozen bodies. That afternoon, I was assigned to Sector 5. A heating unit had failed, and temperatures were dropping rapidly. Mason and I suited up in thermal gear and headed down the winding corridors. Sector 5 was isolated, colder than the rest of the facility, the walls covered in frost. Keep your mask on, Mason warned as we entered. No matter what. I nodded, adjusting my insulated hood. The temperature was unnatural, even for the Arctic, so cold it burned my exposed skin. We worked in silence, our breath forming thick clouds in the air. The pipes had frozen over, thick ice creeping along the steel like veins. Then, something caught my eye. At the far end of the corridor was a locked storage room, but the door was slightly ajar. A gust of freezing wind leaked from inside, carrying something else with it. A smell. Rot. I glanced at Mason. He hadn't noticed. My heart pounded as I stepped toward the door. Slowly, cautiously, I pushed it open, and I nearly screamed. Bodies, lined up in rows. Pale, frostbitten bodies, their eyes wide open, lips cracked and frozen mid-scream. Their uniforms, they were the same as the other shift. I staggered back, ball rising in my throat. Mason. He was already grabbing me, shoving me out of the room. Don't look, he snapped, slamming the door shut. Who the hell are they? I gasped. He exhaled, his breath visible in the frozen air. They should be dead. I stared at him, heart hammering. Should be. His eyes flickered toward the security cameras. Then he whispered, they don't leave. They just change. The blackout. That night, I lay awake again, waiting, listening. 10 p.m. came. The halls were silent. No knocking, no whispers. But then, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then, darkness. The emergency backup should have kicked in. It didn't. The base was completely silent. Then, footsteps. Heavy, slow, coming down the hall. I held my breath. Then, my door handle twisted. I froze. The lock rattled. A soft exhale came from the other side. Then knocking. Knock, knock, knock. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't open it. The air grew colder. I could see my breath. Then I heard it. A whisper. From the vent. James. Something moved inside the walls. Scraping. Crawling. James. Open the door. The knocking grew harder. Bang. 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 Then, something new. A voice outside the door. But not a whisper. A deep, distorted voice. James, it's Mason. Let me in. No. No, it wasn't. I gripped the edge of my bed, heart hammering. Come on, man. Open up. I knew what Mason's voice sounded like. And this wasn't it. Then, scraping from the vent again, and from the darkness, I saw it. A hand, sliding through the grate. Only this time, it wasn't pale. It was blackened, frostbitten, like the bodies I'd seen in the storage room. One of them was in the walls. I clamped a hand over my mouth, my pulse thundering in my ears. Then, the door handle stopped moving. The vent went silent. And slowly, the temperature returned to normal. I stayed awake until morning. And when I finally left my room, Mason was waiting for me. His face was pale. We need to talk. Now. Beneath the ice. Mason didn't waste time. He pulled me into an empty storage room, shut the door, and locked it. His hands were shaking. We don't have long, he muttered. They're watching. I swallowed, my throat dry. Ooh, he hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, everyone, the experiment. Mason paced the small room, rubbing his temples. You've seen them now, haven't you? The other shift. I asked. The bodies in Sector 5. Mason stopped. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. They're not bodies, James. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Were they then? He exhaled, running a hand down his face. This place isn't just a research base. It's an experiment. I stiffened. Years ago, they found something buried in the ice, he continued. Something old. Something that should have stayed buried. A deep dread curled around my ribs. What did they find? Mason hesitated. Then, finally, he whispered, "A door." My breath hitched. They dug it up, tried to open it. And when they did, he trailed off, shaking his head. They weren't the same after that. I thought about the scratched walls near Sector 6. The way the other shift moved, like puppets on broken strings. I swallowed hard. Are they dead? Mason looked at me, his eyes filled with something worse than fear. Guilt. They should be, he said, but they're still walking. I felt my pulse quicken. If this place is a cover-up, why don't they just kill us? Mason gave a dry laugh. Who says they haven't? A chill ran down my spine. Then, the alarm blared. Mason's head snapped up. Shit. The lights flickered red. A voice crackled over the intercom. Emergency lockdown. All personnel return to quarters immediately. Mason grabbed my arm. Run. Sector 6 opens. We sprinted through the corridors, the facility shaking beneath our feet. I could hear something. A deep, resonant humming that made my teeth ache. It came from below, from Sector 6. Ahead of us, the security door slammed shut. We were locked in. Mason cursed. They're opening it. I turned to him. Opening what? The door beneath the ice, he said breathlessly. They're letting it out. Then, the lights went out. Everything plunged into darkness. I heard footsteps behind us. Slow, unsteady. Then, the sound of something wet dragging across the floor. Mason grabbed my wrist. James, don't move. I held my breath. The thing came closer. I could hear it breathing, ragged, unnatural. The air turned ice cold. And then, a voice. Low, hollow, not human. We see you. My blood ran cold. Mason lunged for a side door, dragging me through. He slammed it shut behind us. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, Mason turned to me, his face grim. We're getting out of here. The descent. Mason led me down a back corridor, toward an emergency escape tunnel. But as we approached, we heard something ahead. A single, rhythmic knock. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach twisted. Mason cursed under his breath. They're already here. Then a voice. James. It was coming from the vents. I turned slowly. The grate had been ripped open. I felt something move in the darkness beyond. I barely had time to react before something lunged at me. The thing beneath the ice. The thing lunged at me from the vent. I barely had time to react before cold, leathery hands wrapped around my throat. I hit the floor hard, gasping as my breath fogged in the freezing air. The thing's face loomed over me, blackened, frostbitten, its lips split wide in a grin that was too big, too wrong. And then it spoke. James. But the voice wasn't coming from its mouth. It was coming from inside my own head. I screamed. Mason yanked me back, slamming the thing with a fire extinguisher. It didn't bleed. It just twitched, its limbs jerking like a puppet with cut strings. Run! Mason shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. The path to Sector 6. We sprinted through the corridors, the facility shaking violently around us. Warning alarms blared. The red emergency lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. A voice crackled over the intercom, garbled and barely human. Containment breach, evacuation failure. They are awake. I turned to Mason. What the hell does that mean? He didn't answer. He was staring at the corridor ahead. The door to Sector 6 was wide open, and from the darkness beyond, a deep, guttural humming resonated through the halls. It was deafening, vibrating inside my skull. I stumbled forward, clutching my ears. What is that? Mason's face was pale. It's calling to us. The descent into madness. Mason grabbed a rifle from the emergency weapons locker. I did the same, though my hands were shaking too hard to aim properly. We have to stop it, Mason muttered. Before it spreads. I didn't ask what it was. I already knew. The thing they found buried beneath the ice. The thing they tried to contain. And now it was awake. We stepped through the threshold into Sector 6. The temperature dropped instantly. My breath turned to fog. My eyelashes frosted over. The walls were lined with massive steel containment units. Some still locked. Others torn open. Then I saw it. The door beneath the ice. It was massive. Circular. Ancient. The metal was blackened, pulsing faintly with an unnatural glow. And it was open. Something was coming through. The horror revealed. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. It was everywhere. A mass of shifting, writhing black tendrils that moved like liquid shadow. They slithered across the walls, pulsing and twitching like they were alive. Faces flickered within the dark mass, distorted, frozen expressions trapped in eternal agony. I recognized some of them. The other shift. Mason raised his rifle. Don't let it touch you. I barely had time to react before the shadows lunged. We fired. The bullets did nothing. The black mass twisted and reformed, absorbing the rounds like they were nothing. Then, something stepped forward from the writhing dark. A human shape. At least, it had been human once. Its skin was blackened with frostbite. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness. Its mouth opened in a slow, painful stretch, revealing rows of jagged, ice-covered teeth. And then it spoke. Cold, so cold. It took another step forward, then another. I felt my body lock up. My limbs stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. I realized it wasn't walking. It was pulling me forward. The final choice. Mason grabbed my shoulder. James, don't look at it. He pulled me back, breaking my paralysis. Then he ran toward the control panel. What are you doing? I shouted. Mason turned, his face resolute. I'm sealing the door. My stomach dropped. Mason, you won't make it out. He gave me a small, tired smile. I was never making it out. Then, he slammed the emergency lockdown switch. The alarm screamed. The doors began to close. And Mason, he didn't run. He turned toward the thing and whispered, "Come and get me." The black mass engulfed him. And then, the door slammed shut. Escape or not? I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The bass shook violently. The intercom crackled. Self-destruct sequence initiated. Evacuate immediately. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. Through the collapsing corridors, past the bodies of those who never made it out. I reached the emergency exit, slammed the release button. The Arctic wind howled as I burst outside, the cold biting into my skin. Behind me, the base exploded. A deep, earth-shattering rumble echoed beneath the ice. The ground split open. I saw something massive shifting beneath the surface. Tendrils, faces, moving in the ice itself. Then it stopped. The ground went still. The wind howled. And then, silence. I exhaled, my breath fogging in the frozen air. Was it over? I took one step forward. And then, I heard it. A single, rhythmic knock. 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 From beneath the ice. I stared down in horror. Because in the frost-covered ground, barely visible, something knocked back. The end.